Thank you, Jameson, and thank you all for your patience. First of all, I want to thank Jameson. He has been just marvelous in putting this all together and encouraging me to do this evening, and I'm overwhelmed by the wonderful people who are here this evening, so many of whom are dear friends. First thing is to tell you why I wrote this book. When I was in college, I decided that I wanted to go into politics, and I thought the best way to do it was to find a mentor. And I had heard a lot about this young U.S. Senator from Massachusetts, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. I would keep trying, and I tried and tried again to get to meet Kennedy. And finally, they agreed, his staff, Ted Reardon, who was his administrative assistant, and he said, okay, but he only has a couple of minutes. And he asked all kinds of interesting questions. And he said, look, I'm very busy right now. I can't talk any further, but I'm sufficiently interested that I will see you at my apartment in Boston. That's how we got together.
When you were in the Navy, he wrote you? Is that right?
Very good, Jameson. Yes, he wrote me in the Navy. One day the captain called me into his cabin and he said, Hyman, I see that you have material here from Senator John F. Kennedy. Well, does he have to say anything about the ship or me? And then, evil that I am, I thought of an idea and I said, I'm sorry, Captain. I cannot tell you the contents of this envelope. And from then on, I was treated like a prince on that thing. All that was in there was almost a mimeographed copy of a speech he had given. There was not much rapport between Kennedy and the then governor of Massachusetts, a man named Endicott Peabody. His nickname was Chub. At one point, I was the assistant to the governor. Governor Peabody was honorable enough and sensitive enough to know that there was not very much goodwill between him and Kennedy. And so he said to me, Lester, you're going to go to the White House and take care of the issues involving Massachusetts. So I went to the White House and did the work of Massachusetts with the two closest people to President Kennedy, Kenny O'Donnell and Larry O'Brien. And when we got finished, Kenny said to me, would you like to say hello to the president? I said, well, can I? And he said, of course you can. You know how much he likes you. Come on. So I went in there, and President Kennedy was seated at his desk, his hands down. He was writing something. And I stood, and finally he looked up and pointed his finger at me. He said, Lester, you get out of here. You're the kiss of death. I almost fainted on the spot. I said, Mr. President, what have I done? I told you to work for Johnny Powers for mayor. You did, he lost. I told you to work for Eddie McLaughlin for Congress. You did, he lost. He went through a whole litany of them and then said, I'm up for re-election next year. You're the kiss of death, now get the hell out of here. So at this point, I was frightened to death. I turned around and headed for the door. And all of a sudden I heard this voice saying, come back, I'm only kidding you. It was the president. And that's the kind of relationship we had. But I'll never forget. Neither will I never forget Jameson triggering my mind to tell that story.
Well, I found just how much you knew members of the family also very interesting, and RFK, Rose Kennedy, the mother, Teddy, of course, was a personal friend of yours.
Robert F. Kennedy. I campaigned for him when he ran for president. One day, I came home and I found out that my son, David, who was then, I think, 10 years old, had a black eye. I said, what happened? He said, well, all the kids in my class wanted Eugene McCarthy for the Democratic nomination for president, and I said I wanted Bobby Kennedy, and they beat me up. And I said, well, you know, just because your father is working for Bob Kennedy doesn't mean you have to. And I'll never forget it. David said, no, Dad, I'm for Bobby. And so we're on the road one day. I was just talking with Robert Kennedy, and I told him the story. I said, did you ever have problems like this with your kids? And he looked at me with those steely eyes of his, and he said, yes, 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 and he walked off. And I thought to myself, you insensitive son of a bitch. And one day, David came running into the room and showed me a letter. And it was a letter from Robert F. Kennedy to David Hyman, in which he, and you'll find it in the book, reproduced as it was, that Bobby was proud of him supporting him. And when I saw Bobby the next day, I said to him, Bob, why didn't you say you were doing something, you were going to do something that was so nice when I talked to you about it? And Robert Kennedy said, you're not the problem, your kid is. I said, okay, that makes sense. And then he instructed me that he was going to make a speech in June in Boston at the Statler Hotel. And he told me that I should take a room in the hotel. And after he finished the speech, Bob Kennedy would come up, he said, and spend 30 minutes with your son, which was a lovely, lovely gesture. The problem is he never made it. That was in June. He was killed in April.
Speaking about RFK and his tragic passing, you riding in the train following that event, would you kind of share some?
Yeah, that is interesting. They had a funeral train from New York, from the cathedral to Washington. And it was amazing to look out the window and see thousands of people. The coffin was in a separate car. People couldn't see it from the ground. Ethel Kennedy, Bobby's widow, suggested that we put the coffin on the chairs so they'd be high enough and people could see it as the train went by. And it was eerie. I and 3 other people held it for about an hour, and then we got another group. When we got to Washington, and it's pitch dark, and we're supposed to have a funeral service, and Ted Kennedy rushed over to a nearby church, and he got all the candles that they would give him and brought them back so we could have a candlelit ceremony. I still have one of those candles in my office. Robert Kennedy was a very, very interesting person. My thesis is that he played being the tough guy. It was all a facade. He was a very quiet, very sensitive young man.
We'll open it up to questions.
How, in your experience, did each of the next younger brother react to the assassination of the next older one?
To be honest, I cannot answer that question because Bob and Ted went into hiding for quite a while. And I sent a condolence note to each of them, and I got a handwritten note back from each of them, which was quite amazing, thanking me for saying the things I did about John F. Kennedy. But that's about all I can tell you.
What was President Kennedy's and Bobby Kennedy's relationship with Lyndon Johnson like?
I'll try and sum it up. After John Kennedy died, all the state chairs were invited to the White House by Lyndon Johnson.
You were the chair of the Massachusetts Democratic
I was chair of the Massachusetts Democratic Party at that point. And Lyndon Johnson came over to me and he put his arms around me and he was nose to nose, and I've got a big nose, but his was bigger. And he said, Mr. Hyman, I want to ask you a question. I said, what is it, Mr. President? Well, you're me, you got it? I said, okay. And you're in Vietnam, and you've got a choice. You can either bomb them and stop them, or don't bomb them and let our boys be killed. Now what would you do? He started poking me. And I said at the moment, which I regretted, I said, bomb him. He did not have charisma, but he was a true liberal. He was doing wonderful things for children, for sick people, and yet he got stuck with this Vietnam. It wasn't his beginning. He relied heavily on Kennedy's people because Johnson did not pretend to be an expert on foreign policy. whatever the former Kennedy people, you know, McNamara and those people suggested, he assumed was correct. And that was part of his downfall. And I want to thank all of you. I know it's getting late, and I appreciate so much that you're coming. With no more questions, and many of you taking the book, and I'm grateful to you for it. I also want to introduce Jamie Alexander. She's a student at American University, and she's been my personal assistant throughout this whole conference. So I think that's it.
Lester
Thank you.
Hyman, everybody.